Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 18 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard the sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode, Georg Forster and his companions returned to Long Island in Queen Charlotte Sound at the northern tip of New Zealand's South Island. There the crew sowed European seeds in Maori soil, explored steep ridges, and discovered nesting seabirds and greenstone. Among the rocks, they found signs of past volcanic activity and the sacred Maori stone known as punamu. Maori families arrived by canoe to trade fish, tools, and memories, including a touching moment when they remembered Tupaia. But cultural exchange soon became uneasy, as young women were offered in return for iron goods, raising troubling questions about power and consent. Tensions rose further when a stolen jacket sparked a fistfight between a sailor and a local youth, revealing deep cultural misunderstandings. Still, Captain Cook focused on the future. He planted gardens across the Sound, hoping that European crops would grow, and that his visit would leave behind nourishment, not just stories.
Tuesday, 1st of June, 1773, Ship Cove, Queen Charlotte Sound, New Zealand.
In the morning, several canoes arrived that the crew had not seen before. These vessels varied in size, and 3 of them were equipped with sails, a rare feature among them. The sail was made of a large triangular mat, fastened on one side to a mast and on the other to a pole. Both mast and pole met below at a sharp angle and could be easily detached or lowered. The upper, broader part of the sail was decorated along the hem with 5 brown feather tufts. The base of each canoe consisted of a hollowed-out tree trunk, while the sides were made of planks. These were stacked and bound together using small holes and cords made from New Zealand flax. The seams were tightly sealed with the wool of bulrushes. Among these canoes were some double-hulled types, meaning 2 hulls were joined side by side with crossbeams and ropes. The rest were single-hulled and fitted with an outrigger, a narrow plank attached on one side to stabilize the otherwise easily capsizing vessels. All these canoes appeared old and nearly worn out. None were as richly adorned with carvings or artistic detail as those Captain Cook had seen during his first voyage to the northern island of New Zealand. However, their construction was essentially the same. Typically, they featured a roughly carved human face at the bow, a tall stern, and sharply pointed paddles. The owners brought several of their ornaments for trade, most of which were carved from green lapis nephriticus, nephrite jade. Many of these items were new to the observers in both shape and craftsmanship. Some of the items were flat with sharp edges, shaped like axe or hatchet blades. Others were long and thin, used as earrings. Still, others had been sharpened into small chisels and mounted into wooden handles. Finally, there were a few ornaments laboriously carved into crouching figures, vaguely resembling human forms, with large inlaid mother-of-pearl eyes. These decorations, called etigi, were worn by both men and women on cords hanging around their necks. The observers assumed that the pieces must have had some kind of religious significance. Among the traded goods was a knee apron made from tightly woven cloth, decorated with red feathers, trimmed with white dog fur on the sides, and adorned with pieces of abalone shell. Such garments were said to be worn by women during their dances. They also acquired a number of fishing hooks, crude pieces made of wood with barbed bone tips, which, according to the islanders, had been crafted from human bone. In addition to the tigi, or sometimes in its place, some individuals wore strings of human teeth. However, these were not considered as precious as described in Captain Cook's earlier voyage. They were willingly traded for iron tools or other small items. The islanders had brought many dogs in their canoes and seemed to value them highly. Each animal was tied around the waist with a cord. They were a long-haired breed with pointed ears, very similar to the common shepherd dog, or Buffon's chien de berger, and came in a variety of colors, some spotted, others black, and some pure white. These dogs were mostly fed with fish and thus lived just as well as their owners. In return, their flesh was eaten, and their pelts were used for decoration and garments. The crew bought a few of the animals, but the older ones did not adapt well. They refused to eat and pined away. The younger dogs, however, quickly grew accustomed to shipboard food. Some of the New Zealanders who had come aboard were led into the cabin, where they were given a few gifts. Yet not one of them displayed the amazement, thoughtfulness, or curiosity they had seen in their old friend from Dusky Bay. A few of the men had peculiar facial tattoos, deep spiral incisions. Especially striking were the markings of a tall, strong man of middle age, whose forehead, nose, and chin were carved in a highly regular pattern. The cuts were so deep that, although his beard must have been thick and strong, only a few scattered hairs remained. His name was Tringo Waya, and he appeared to hold a certain status above the others, something they had not yet observed among the smaller groups that had visited the ship. Of all the trade goods, the men preferred shirts and bottles. The latter were particularly valued, probably because they had no other containers for liquids, except for small gourds, which only grew on the northern island and were already rare in Charlotte Sound. They always tried to arrange trades in their favor and asked high prices for even the smallest items. However, they did not become upset if their offers were declined. Since some of the visitors were in a cheerful mood, they gave a performance on the ship's aft deck. To begin, they removed their thick, shaggy outer garments and stood in a row. One man began singing, stretching out his arms alternately while stamping his feet furiously, almost like a man possessed. The others mimicked his gestures and repeatedly echoed the last words of his song, which seemed to function as a refrain or chorus. The visitors could discern a certain rhythm or syllabic pattern, but it was unclear whether the verses rhymed. The lead singer's voice was rather poor, and the melody was extremely simple, consisting of only a few alternating tones.
Traditional Maori songs, known as waiata, are an essential part of Maori culture, performed by groups rather than individuals. Waiata are often sung in unison and are deeply connected to oral tradition, helping to preserve history, genealogy, and cultural knowledge across generations. They are often performed without instrumental accompaniment and follow a distinctive melodic line that may seem unusual to European ears. In the context of receiving guests, Maori will often perform waiata tautoko, supporting songs after a speech of welcome to affirm and strengthen the speaker's words. These songs are performed by the entire group and serve to create a bond between host and visitors. In formal ceremonies, especially a pauhiri, a traditional welcoming ritual, waiata accompany each stage of the process, reinforcing unity and shared values. To the Maori, waiata are not just music, they are living expressions of identity, emotion, and memory. Whether joyful or solemn, they are performed with deep feeling and carry the collective voice of the community. Through waiata, Maori continue to connect with their ancestors, celebrate their heritage, and welcome others into their world with dignity and warmth.
In the evening, the islanders returned to the upper end of the sound from where they had come. The following morning, they accompanied Captains Cook and Furneaux to East Bay and Grass Cove. There, The two commanders intended to collect a boatload of anti-scorbutic herbs, and also to make another attempt to benefit the land. Since, as previously mentioned, they had already taken great care to plant various useful European herbs and root vegetables, they now wanted to enrich the wilderness with animals that could one day be useful to both the islanders and future seafarers. To that end, Captain Furneaux had already released a boar and 2 sows into the woods of Cannibal Cove, hoping they would multiply. That day, a billy goat and a nanny goat were also brought ashore at a remote spot in East Bay. These regions had been chosen specifically because the new colonists would likely be safest from the local population there, who were, after all, the only threat the animals might face. It was unlikely that the New Zealanders would understand the long-term benefits that might arise from allowing such useful creatures to reproduce undisturbed. Near Grass Cove, they spotted a large animal in the water. Judging by its size, it might have been a sea lion, but they were unable to approach it closely enough to shoot or examine it. If it had indeed been a sea lion, then along with a small species of bat they had encountered in the forests and the local tame dog, the list of New Zealand's mammals had already grown to 5 genera, and it was doubtful that many more would be discovered, even with future expeditions.
Before the arrival of humans, New Zealand had almost no native land mammals. The only known indigenous mammals were 2 species of bats, the long-tailed bat and the lesser short-tailed bat. Both are small, nocturnal, insect-eating mammals that evolved in isolation over millions of years. This extreme lack of land-dwelling mammals is one of New Zealand's most unique ecological features. Because there were no native land predators like cats, foxes, or weasels, many birds evolved to be flightless, ground-nesting, and relatively fearless. Iconic examples include the kiwi, kakapo, and moa, which is now extinct. The absence of mammals also led to unusual evolutionary adaptations. For example, the short-tailed bat is one of the few bat species in the world that forages on the ground as well as in the air, essentially filling the ecological role of small mammals in a forest environment. Marine mammals such as seals and whales were present around the coastline, but New Zealand's terrestrial ecosystem developed almost entirely without mammals until humans introduced them. First the Polynesians with the Polynesian rat and dogs, and later Europeans with species like cats, rabbits, stoats, and deer. These introductions had dramatic and often devastating effects on the native flora and fauna.
After they had roamed far and wide through the forest, collecting a fair supply of wild celery and scurvy grass, and once again discovering several new plants and birds, they returned to the ship late in the day.
Thursday, June 3rd, 1773, Ship Cove, Queen Charlotte Sound.
Several boats were sent to Long Island to bring back the hay. Now that the ships had been made ready to sail, with wood and water taken on board, and the crew fully recovered thanks to the healthy local herbs, nothing stood in their way of setting off again at the next opportunity. On the return trip, one of their boats spotted a large double canoe and another smaller one, together carrying around 50 men. Both vessels immediately began chasing the boat. Since the crew had no weapons, they quickly set up a sail and soon managed to gain enough distance that the New Zealanders abandoned the pursuit and turned back toward East Bay from where they had come. Although they couldn't say for sure that these people had hostile intentions, it would not have been wise for the sailors to risk encountering such a vastly superior number of men, especially a group prone to acting by instinct and impulse rather than reason or fairness. On the morning of June 4th, they hoisted the St. George's flag, banners, and pennants to celebrate the birthday of His Majesty the King with the usual naval festivities. The Maori family, whose names had already been given and who had now become quite familiar since they had set up their camp near the ship, came on board very early that day. As the officers and chiefs sat down to breakfast in the wardroom, a message came from the deck. From the north, a large double canoe, heavily manned, was approaching. They went up and saw it was only about 1 musket shot away, carrying 28 men. It passed by the Adventure and headed for their ship, perhaps assuming from its size that it was the lead vessel. The Maori guests on board insisted that the newcomers had hostile intentions and urged them to open fire. Towahanga, the leader of the family, jumped on the gun chest at the stern, seized a club, and began making fierce and warlike gestures. He then addressed the newcomers with great intensity, speaking in a solemn tone and swinging a large greenstone axe above his head, a weapon they had not seen him carry before. Meanwhile, the canoe drew near, but paid no attention to their friend's warnings. So they asked him to stop and be silent. 2 men stood in the canoe, one at the bow, the other in the center, while the rest remained seated. The first wore a black cloak of thick cloth, inlaid with square patches of dog fur. He held a green flax plant and occasionally uttered a few words. The second gave a loud, clear, and ceremonial speech. He varied his voice skillfully, raising and lowering his tone to alternate between questioning, boasting, threatening, challenging, and trying to appease. Sometimes he spoke moderately, then suddenly shouted so loudly that he had to pause for breath. When he finished, Captain Cook invited him on board. At first, the orator hesitated and seemed unsure, but soon his natural boldness overcame his mistrust, and he climbed onto the ship. His companions followed, and each one greeted the Maori family already on board in the local fashion, by pressing noses together. As the sailors jokingly said, they nosed each other. Then they honored the officers the same way, greeting everyone on deck. The 2 main speakers were invited into the captain's cabin. The second man, who was the actual speaker, was named Teiratu. According to his own words, he was from the northern island of the country, called Teiratu. They immediately asked about Tupaia, and when told that he was no longer alive, they, like the previously mentioned islanders, seemed deeply saddened and spoke a few words in a sorrowful and mournful tone. Such was the respect and affection this man had earned from these simple and uneducated people through his natural talents and warm nature. It was likely that he, more than any of them, would have succeeded in bringing some form of culture to this nation, because he not only had a deep knowledge of the local language, but also shared more common ground with their spirit and understanding than the Europeans did. What hindered the visitors in this endeavor was the vast gap between their own extensive knowledge and the extremely limited understanding of the locals. It was as if they didn't even know where to find the links that could connect the 2 chains of thought. Teiratu and his companions were a taller kind of people than those previously seen in New Zealand. None among them were short, and many were clearly above average height. Their clothing, ornaments, and weapons were also more elaborate than what had been observed among the inhabitants of Queen Charlotte Sound. They seemed to reflect a kind of wealth and abundance not yet encountered in the region. Some of their cloaks were fully lined with dog fur. These garments appeared to be especially valued by their owners. Indeed, such fur coats not only looked impressive but likely served them well in the cold weather now being felt. Among their other garments made from the fibers of the New Zealand flax, there were many entirely new pieces, decorated with woven borders in red, black, and white. These patterns were so precisely worked that one could have taken them for the craftsmanship of a more advanced people. The black dye used in their fabrics was so rich and lasting that it deserved the attention of English manufacturers, who still lacked a truly durable, plant-based black dye. Unfortunately, only their limited knowledge of the language prevented them from learning more details. Their garments were essentially cloaks, made from rectangular pieces of cloth. The 2 upper corners were tied at the chest with cords or fastened with a needle made from bone, fishbone, or greenstone. Roughly in the middle of the cloak, an inner belt of tightly braided grass was sewn in. This belt could be tied around the waist, causing the garment to sit firmly at the hips and allowing the lower edge to hang down to the knees, or even to the calves. Although they outwardly seemed far superior to the inhabitants of Queen Charlotte Sound, they were just as unclean as those people. Lice crawled by the dozens over their garments. Following local custom, they wore their hair tied up at the crown of the head, smeared with grease, and adorned with white feathers. Some had large combs made of whale bones stuck behind the topknot, standing upright like spikes. Many of them had snail-shaped lines tattooed on their faces, and some had their skin smeared with red ochre and oil. They all seemed to take great delight when red paint was rubbed onto their cheeks. They carried small gourds containing the oil used for anointing themselves, though it was unclear whether this oil came from plants or animals. All of their tools and accessories were very finely carved and generally crafted with great care. They sold one item with a blade made from the finest green nephrite and a handle elaborately decorated in high relief. Among their possessions, the crew also found a few musical instruments, including a trumpet, or more accurately, a wooden tube, about 1.2 meters, 4 feet in length, and relatively narrow. The mouthpiece measured no more than 5 centimeters, 2 inches in diameter, while the bell at the opposite end was approximately 12.5 centimeters, 5 inches, wide. They always played the same tone, which resembled the bleating of an animal. Still, it seemed possible that a skilled horn player might have coaxed a more refined sound from the instrument. Another trumpet was made from a large Triton shell, fitted with intricately carved wood, and featuring an opening at the end, used as the mouthpiece. A terribly bellowing sound was all that could be produced with this instrument. A third one, which the crew called a flute, consisted of a hollow tube that was widest in the middle and had an opening there, as well as at both ends. This and the first instrument were each made from 2 hollow pieces of wood, cut precisely to fit together and form a continuous pipe. The double canoe in which some of the men had arrived still appeared new and was about 15 meters, 50 feet long. Both the prow and the high stern were intricately carved with spiral patterns, just as described in the account of Captain Cook's earlier voyage. At the very front, a crude figure with vaguely human features formed the tip of the bow. It was decorated with a pair of pearl shell eyes and a long tongue protruding from its mouth. Such figures were used as decorations everywhere, especially on objects related to warfare and weaponry. The widespread local custom of insulting and challenging enemies by sticking out the tongue had likely led to the frequent use of such grotesque faces. These carvings could be found not only at the bow of their war canoes and on the handles of their axes, but also hanging from cords around their necks, even engraved on their scoops and paddles. They did not remain long on board. When the wind picked up, they all returned to their boats and rowed over to Aotearoa. Around midday, the captain, accompanied by several officers, was ferried to the island and found 7 canoes pulled up onto the beach, with about 90 Maori newly arrived. All were busy building huts and welcomed the English visitors with every imaginable show of friendliness. The commander reciprocated with a variety of gifts, including gilded copper medals. These were about 4.5 centimeters, 1 3/4 inches, in diameter, and had been specially struck to commemorate the voyage, to be distributed among the various peoples they encountered. One side showed a bust of the king with the inscription, George III, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. The other side depicted 2 warships named Resolution and Adventure, with the inscription below, sailed from England March 1772. Similar mementos had already been distributed to locals in Dusky Bay and here in Queen Charlotte Sound. The large number of Maori gathered at this site offered the crew a great opportunity to barter for weapons, tools, clothing, and ornaments, in exchange for iron goods and glass beads, items which these Maori possessed in far greater abundance than any of their fellow countrymen the crew had met before. The captain and his party noticed that Teiratu was evidently the leader of the group, as everyone showed him remarkable deference. The exact nature of his authority remained unclear. Elderly men were generally respected, likely for their experience, but that couldn't have been the case here, as such leaders, like Teiratu, were strong and spirited men in the prime of life. Perhaps the Maori, like the North American indigenous peoples, had realized that in times of war, a large group needs a leader whose superior skills and talents could be trusted. For such a role, only young men with energy and vigor were suitable. The more the travelers observed the warlike nature of this nation and the many small factions it was divided into, the more essential such a leadership structure appeared. They had likely learned through experience that leadership qualities could not be inherited and didn't necessarily pass from father to son. Perhaps they had also seen evidence that hereditary rule naturally tends toward despotism. Captain Cook feared that the Maori might discover the garden his crew had planted on the island and destroy it out of ignorance. So he personally led Teiratu there and showed him all the different plants, especially the potatoes. These seemed to be appreciated by the local chief. He likely already knew them. As a similar plant, the sweet potato was grown in some parts of the North Island, where Teiratu was from. He promised the captain not to damage the garden, but to let everything grow and multiply undisturbed. With this agreement, the two parted ways. Once Cook was back on board, the Marines fired a 3-volley salute in honor of the royal birthday, and the sailors gave 3 loud cheers. In the afternoon, the wind grew very strong and remained just as fierce for 2 days. Therefore, they had to stay anchored until the 7th. Then, in the morning, they raised anchor and set sail from Ship Cove, together with the Adventure. The stay in Queen Charlotte Sound had done the men so much good that they were now as healthy as they had been when leaving England. On board their ship, there was only one remaining sick man, a Marine who had suffered from dizziness and dropsy ever since their departure from home. In the afternoon, they entered Cook Strait and sailed southward through it, now facing the vast ocean known as the South Sea. This immense body of water had already been traversed in many parts closer to the equator, where the climate was warmer and more favorable. However, the colder regions, those so-called middle latitudes, had remained unexplored by European sailors until Captain Cook's first voyage aboard the Endeavour in 1770. Despite this, it had long been widely believed that a large continent must exist in these waters. Geographers, who marked it on maps as Terra Australis, thought that New Zealand formed its western edge, and that on the eastern side a stretch of land, allegedly sited near America, completed its boundaries. But on his previous voyage, Cook had discovered that New Zealand consisted merely of 2 large islands. He had also confirmed that there was no land between there and the 40th parallel south, nor toward the east in the direction of the Americas. Since then, the supposed southern continent had already been considerably reduced in size, yet it still occupied a vast area worthy of further exploration. The crew was now about to sail into that still uncharted portion of the sea, embarking, despite the fact that it was the middle of winter, on a journey between the 50th and 40th parallels south, in search of new lands toward the east. Many of the travelers undertook this dangerous voyage with confidence, certain they would soon find the coast of this southern land, and that the novelty and usefulness of its natural products would more than compensate for all the hardship and peril. Captain Cook, however, along with several others who drew on the results of the previous voyage and their current observations, held out little hope of discovering new territory. In fact, they doubted whether any southern continent existed at all.
This concludes part 18 of Georg Forster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of James Cook. I have linked a map of the locations of this episode in the show notes. For those who would like to see the locations of the journey around the world on the present day, I recommend my YouTube channel, Voyage to Go. There, I visit the places from Georg Forster's travel narrative and try to uncover traces and connections between today and the past. So that was episode 18 of our journey around the world with Georg Forster, Captain Cook and the HMS Resolution, on which we will continue our travels together in the coming weeks. I hope we can travel a little further together, because life is a journey. Being part of it is everything.